This is Monique with MSCI. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to let everyone know that you will receive the presentation slides and a link to this webinar recording once it's over, probably later this afternoon. And since this is a flash 30-minute webinar, I'm going to hand things right over to you, Mike. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Monique. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the series of webinars offered by MSCI. My name is Mike Mulhern, and I'm a principal at the management consulting firm Clover Lane Partners, where I work with organizations to teach and improve the skills that managers need to lead teams. Before founding Clover Lane, I was a labor and employment relations attorney for 31 years at a large international law firm here in Chicago, where I represented companies in a wide range of employment matters, from compliance and strategic business initiatives to litigation in federal and state courts. Over the years, I've also been a regular instructor on employment-related subjects at graduate business schools, professional conferences, and continuing education programs. I mention this because from these collective experiences and perspectives, I've seen the critical importance of people management, not just in the avoidance of legal problems, but in driving the overall success of business organizations. Today, I want to provide some guidance and tips for managing remote work teams. A few introductory comments about today's webinar. Obviously, working from home is not an option in many work environments, but if you're participating in this webinar, I assume that in your organization, remote work arrangements are in place for at least some segments of the workforce. Number two, I've structured this webinar to include guidance for all managers and supervisors who are leading remote work teams. But as the webinar title suggests, I'll focus in particular on managers who, right before COVID-19, had their teams in one location and then were suddenly forced into the position of managing team members in multiple locations. Also, and as Monique mentioned, I've titled this a flash webinar because it's scheduled for about 30 minutes. It may go a little longer. Most of the concepts and principles I'm going to cover should be familiar, but I think of it like Major League Baseball players who every year go to spring training and work on the same fundamentals they learned as little leaguers. So too for supervisors and HR professionals who are managing newly remote work teams. They need to refocus and recommit to fundamental management principles that have always guided how they deal with employees. Two quick housekeeping items before we get into today's presentation. First, there's a box on your computer screen where you can type in a question. I'll look at those at the end of the webinar and answer as many of them as I can. I'm delighted that we have such a good-sized group today, but if I don't get to all of your questions at the end of the webinar, please feel free to forward them to Monique and I'll get back to you. Second, MSCI is trying to cater these webinars to the interests and needs of its members. So if you think of a topic that you'd like to see MSCI cover in a future webinar, please let Monique know. There'll be a place on the survey that you receive at the end of this webinar where you can do that. Okay, let's get started. As the pandemic began to sweep across Europe and the United States earlier this year, life at most business organizations changed very rapidly. A survey of global HR executives taken in mid-March found that 88% of companies had already encouraged or required employees to work from home, and nearly all responding organizations had canceled work-related travel. Now, some of these companies had used remote work teams for years, but for companies that had always required employees to work from an office or some other central location, this was a big adjustment. Relatively few had remote work policies or had trained managers for this situation. But even though most employers were forced to adopt remote work arrangements as an act of crisis management, I think it's important to note that it was a trend which employees already favored. In a 2019 survey by the International Workplace Group, 80% of US workers indicated that they would turn down a job that didn't offer flexible working. 53% of US respondents said that having a choice of work location was more important to them than working for a prestigious company. 74% of respondents described flexible working as the new normal. Now, granted, this survey was conducted before COVID-19 became a worldwide pandemic, and therefore it did not contemplate the type of mandatory and extended work at home arrangements we've seen. But I still think it's worth noting. Why? Well, on one level, it suggests that employees are positively disposed to the idea of working remotely. That could be helpful to companies and managers in their attempts to navigate this transition. But perhaps more importantly, surveys like this one, along with recent announcements from companies across the economy, offer an insight into the future, specifically the remote working arrangements, whether mandatory or voluntary, whether widespread or limited, are likely to continue even after COVID-19 is curtailed. Just in the past several weeks, Facebook, Twitter, and Shopify announced plans to allow employees to work from home in the future. But it's not just the tech and e-commerce companies. Nationwide, Mondelez, and Barclays are among the major companies from other sectors which have announced that they're moving to, or at least considering, permanent work from home positions for much of their staff. It may take some time, but even companies with fewer resources and slower moving cultures are likely to follow, at least to some extent. Now, to be clear, cost cutting and business forecasts are significant drivers in this consideration. But there's another reason, and it strikes a more positive chord. Namely, during these last few months, when they've been forced to embrace remote working, companies are seeing proof that productivity doesn't have to suffer, and that most employees can very effectively accomplish their work tasks outside of their regular workplaces. What does this mean for supervisors and managers? Well, in a nutshell, it means that work from home is not a shooting star, and that they'll need to master the skills required to lead remote teams. Now, I'm sure most of you recognize this, but I offer it as support for discussions with those within your organizations who may view remote work as a temporary accommodation, which doesn't warrant any shift or recommitment to how teams are managed. The bottom line from my point of view is that if you're a manager, you should expect to be dealing with remote work arrangements in one form or another for the foreseeable future, maybe the balance of your careers. Okay, so let's talk about some of the challenges of managing remote work teams, as well as some strategies you can take to deal with those challenges. Since we've been in the COVID remote work period for a couple of months now, I'm going to assume that your organization has already worked through the infrastructure issues. By that, I mean you've made sure employees have the necessary hardware, like laptops, external keyboards, monitors, mobile devices, high-speed internet, etc., as well as the requisite software and other resources to do their work. Obviously, if that's not the case, that should be a starting point for you. Moving beyond the issues of resources, one of the biggest concerns employers have about remote working is whether they can trust employees to work diligently and productively in the absence of face-to-face interaction. This is a fair concern. However, it's a concern not only for managers, but for many employees as well. Managers worry that employees won't work as diligently or as efficiently at home. Employees, on the other hand, struggle with reduced access to managerial support and often feel that remote managers are out of touch with their needs and the work they're doing. The good news for managers is that their concerns appear to be inflated, if not largely unjustified. A 2-year study out of Stanford University, as well as similar recent studies by other researchers, have found that productivity actually increased when employees worked from home. In the Stanford study, some of the factors that contributed to this result were that employees no longer had to spend time commuting to work, and they found it less distracting and easier to concentrate at home. They also took shorter breaks, had fewer sick days, and took less time off. With this understanding, which hopefully is supported by your prior experiences and interactions with your employees, let me start with what I'll call a mental strategy, and that is lead with trust. By that, I mean assume that your team members are working their hardest to be productive, and then address issues from there as necessary. Second, and this is a really big one, up your communication game. As a baseline practice to foster accountability and track progress, schedule regular check-in calls with your team. During those calls, you can get a recap of what they've recently accomplished or are doing. You can discuss top priorities for the current day or week. You can ask and answer questions, and you can address any additional concerns. You're going to go back and pick it up where it went off. I was talking about the communication game. I was noting that these calls don't need to be lengthy and they can be customized for your purpose. For example, some managers like to circulate an agenda in advance. If that works, do it. The important thing is that the calls are regular and predictable, and that they provide an opportunity for the employees to consult with you and ask questions, as well as a chance for you to review progress and priorities. This is a simple strategy, and hopefully it aligns, at least in substance, if not form, with how you communicate with employees when they're all in the same location. Anyway, if you're diligent with check-in calls, it'll go a long way to keeping everyone on track. How frequently should these calls occur? Some remote managers schedule them on a daily basis, but I think it depends on things like the number of employees you manage, their experience levels, and what they're working on. But as a guideline, keep in mind, in a remote work environment, frequency of contact should not go down. It should go up for the whole team and its members. This is especially important for teams that have recently transitioned to working remotely. So whatever you did previously, ramp it up. What form of communication should be used? Of course, regular conference calls can be used, but they only go so far. Your remote team needs to see you and you need to see them, particularly when employees have been working remotely for an extended period of time. So ideally, your check-ins should be through video conferencing, especially for team calls. Video conferencing is effective because it offers many of the visual cues that are available with in-person conferences. Additionally, I think video encourages people to participate in the meetings in a more professional manner and from an appropriate location. Fortunately, services like Zoom and Google Team Hangouts make this relatively easy and affordable. Just make sure to consult with your IT department to confirm there's an appropriate level of data security before using these or any similar tools with company equipment. What about follow-up? Yes, depending on what you talked about in the check-in call, it's often a good idea to send a follow-up communication to ensure that you and the team or a team member are on the same page. This can be done through media like email or Slack message, which then allows you to have multiple touch points to continue the conversation. What about urgent issues that rise in between calls? Well, in addition to regularly scheduled check-in calls and follow-ups, it's important to develop an approach for communicating about unexpected or urgent issues that arise during the course of the workday. In a regular workplace setting, the employees might simply walk into your office, or you might walk down to his workspace. But you'll need to adopt a different approach in a remote setting. Maybe you want to use iMessage or text messages for these purposes. Maybe it's a call to a cell phone. Along the same lines, it's also helpful for employees to know the best times during the workday to reach you, what to do if you're unavailable, as well as the hours during which you expect them to be available for a quick call or to respond to messages. There's no one-size-fits-all here. The important point is that you should communicate regularly with your team, more than you would if you were all working in the same location. So figure out the approach and methods that work best for you and your team. And whatever you decide, make sure they're communicated to employees so that everyone shares the same understanding about how to stay connected. Beyond establishing a consistent and reliable system of communication, another way to ensure employees are productive when they're working remotely is to actively manage their performance. By that, I mean, help your team figure out what they should do and create realistic expectations for their work. Set your team up for success by clearly stating both the tasks and the reasons behind them, and help your team understand exactly how success will be measured. That means defining the scope, deadlines, and deliverables for each task and project your team is working on. Once again, this guidance applies to traditional work settings as well, but it's even more important in remote work environments. I know that some employers utilize different types of task management platforms to view their employees' daily tasks and priorities. Obviously, these systems are more effective for some types of work than others, but if you use them, make sure the employees regularly update their tasks so that you can get an accurate view of not only what's getting done, but how quickly they're working. Finally, recognize that it's simply not possible to manage every aspect of the work done by a remote team or remote employees. If you try to micromanage, you'll waste your whole day and have nothing but a headache to show for it. So instead of focusing on what your team is doing every minute of the day, focus on the outcomes, which should be based on the priorities and expectations you set in your regular calls and follow-ups, and then measure your team accordingly. Another challenge for managers is keeping employee morale high. Indeed, loneliness is one of the most common complaints about remote work because employees enjoy and miss the informal social interaction of a regular workplace setting. When the remote work arrangement has come about unexpectedly or lasts for an extended period of time, isolation can cause employees to feel less belonging to their organization, and in some cases, maybe even a greater desire to leave the company. But managers can be part of the solution. That is, there are things that managers can do to help their teams and employees stay connected and build stronger bonds with each other, all from the relative comfort of their own homes. The options here run the spectrum from very simple to really sophisticated. Maybe the easiest way to create some basic social interaction is to reserve a few minutes at the beginning of your team video conference calls or your one-on-one calls just for non-work items. Maybe ask everyone, how was your weekend, or what was the best part of your weekend? Obviously, if you have check-in calls every day, maybe you ask these questions on the first call of the week. Make a point to connect with everyone and balance the airtime so that all employees feel seen and heard. And make sure you share as well so that you're modeling the same behavior. Also, before the call ends, remember to recognize team members for any achievements and share with the whole team any positive feedback from customers, whether internal or external. Again, these are very simple strategies, but little conversations and comments like these can have a big impact on morale because they make people feel good and they signal that you care about each of them as a person. If you want to take it outside your regularly scheduled work calls, consider organizing a virtual get-together that's focused just on fun. In the last couple of months, I've seen managers use platforms like Zoom to organize virtual happy hours, coffee breaks, team lunches, even a pizza party in which pizza was delivered to the homes of team members at the time of the video conference. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about and participated in virtual get-togethers with friends and family. They may not be a perfect substitute for the real thing, but they're relatively simple ways to maintain a sense of connectedness and camaraderie among your team members. Beyond virtual get-togethers, another option is to create a dedicated online area where employees can discuss things like sports, movies, even a monthly online book club. You can do this through messenger platforms like Slack channel and Basecamp chat, and probably some others. Along the same lines, you can create an online area or a group email where employees can share photos of maybe their pets or from recent holidays or other events. Really, with so much easy and inexpensive technology out there, the options here are wide open. Just make sure your IT group is good with it if you're using company equipment or systems. On the sophisticated end of the spectrum, I've heard that some companies have hosted events where employees can participate in games and contests, watch demos and tutorials, or even receive instruction on how to play an instrument. That one caught my attention too. But hey, even if some of these ideas may sound artificial or hokey, remote workers report that virtual events help reduce feelings of isolation, promote a sense of belonging, and help maintain the connections they had with their office or regular workplace. So with that in mind, think about what might be well received within your group and give it a shot. Be creative. Doesn't have to be fancy. Have fun with it. That's the point. Beyond virtual social events, make sure to offer encouragement and support, particularly when you're talking with employees in one-on-one calls. This is especially important in the context of an abrupt shift to remote work. Express confidence in employees and their teams using phrases like, we can do this, or this is a challenge, but we can handle it. This type of support inspires employees to accept the challenges and work with a sense of purpose and focus. And it'll make them feel like they're part of the team, even while working from home, all of which can keep morale high. Challenge 3, ensuring that employees feel like they know what's going on at the company. It's important that team members feel like they know what's going on. When they're at home and in the absence of communication from their managers, they're left to speculate or worse, rely on external sources like social media. Sometimes their imaginations can run wild, which can be distracting and even unhealthy. So whenever possible, and obviously within the scope of your obligations and responsibilities to the company, clue them in, share information, let them know what's happening at the organizational level, what's happening with customers, maybe some information about the company's goals and objectives, particularly if they've changed. Again, this is something that you can address from time to time during the team video conferences, or if it's a big news item, maybe it's a call scheduled just for that dedicated purpose. And if you address these matters during one-on-one calls, make sure that all employees have access to the same information so no one feels left out, and that it's consistently presented so you don't have multiple versions of the same news event floating around. Challenge 4, dealing with struggling employees. When an employee's regular routines and connections with coworkers have been taken away, some will struggle, particularly when the arrangement is open-ended. As a manager, you need to be ready to help. As in any setting, it's always better to know as early as possible that an employee is having difficulties, because if you know early, you can do something about it. But when the problem has been going on for a while, your options become more limited and it can be difficult to undo any harm that was caused. Regular and well-planned communications with employees, like the ones we've been discussing, should help you to identify problems at an early stage. So when you see possible signs, like fewer emails, delayed responses to your messages, more inhibition in group conversations, or uneasiness in one-on-one calls, talk to the employee, ask how they're doing. Sometimes even a general question like, how's the remote work situation working out for you, can elicit important information about specific problems or difficulties that they're having. Then after you ask the question, listen to their answers. Understand where and why they're struggling. If they need extra help and support, discuss how it can be provided. If it's appropriate, refer them to your employee assistance services and give them direction for getting back on track. Finally, and as always with struggling employees, make sure to follow up to confirm that any remedial action has been effective. If it's not, consider adjustments or other alternatives. Once again, this type of guidance is right out of the playbook most managers would follow in a regular work setting. But with remote work, where you're not with your employees, you need to be more attentive to cues when one of them is struggling and more diligent in how you address the problems. The last challenge I'll talk about today is dealing with the legal implications of remote work. Most of the labor and employment laws, whether at the federal, state, or local level, apply with the same effect regardless of whether employees are working at the office or remotely. This means that companies need to comply with all the applicable laws governing things like equal employment opportunity, occupational safety and health, payroll, meal and rest periods, and a whole slew of other subjects. This also includes dealing with any new laws that have been passed in response to the COVID crisis. For example, the new leave of absence laws that apply to some employers. Anyway, there are thousands of statutes, regs, and judicial decisions at the federal, state, and local levels governing the relationship between employers and employees. So obviously that's way too big for today's webinar. It's way too big for even a semester course in a lot of cases. But for purposes of our discussion today, I want to highlight three of the most common legal concerns that, number one, get the attention of companies in connection with remote work arrangements, and two, you as managers can play a major role in addressing. The first is timekeeping. As I expect most of you know, under the wage and hour laws, a non-exempt employee is one who is subject to the minimum wage and overtime pay standards. When working from home, non-exempt employees must be paid for all time worked, including overtime, the same as if they were working in their regular workplace. In addition, employers must keep track of the hours worked by non-exempt employees, again, the same as in their regular workplace. However, in the regular workplace, many employers use hardware or software to track time, which may be unavailable to an employee working from home. If that's the case, the employer needs to adopt an alternative method that allows the employee to self-report his or her working time. Once a method is adopted, it's important to clearly explain to employees how to track their time, particularly if it's a new system, and then to ensure that the time is being entered into the company's system on a regular basis. Make sure employees understand what the concept or the phrase time worked includes and doesn't include, and specifically deal with meal periods and work performed outside the normal workday. Remember, in a remote setting, time worked may include activities that don't arise in their normal setting. For example, sending an email at the end of the day to advise of progress on a project. Oftentimes, these procedures are outlined in a company's timekeeping policy and distributed to employees. Managers need to reinforce the policy and step in if it's not being followed. When that happens, misunderstandings and innocent mistakes can be corrected quickly and before they turn into big problems. Oops. Another consideration is the privacy and security of business information. When employees work remotely, communications take place in a decentralized environment, and there can be a lot of sensitive information they have access to and submit over wireless networks, things like passwords or personal identifying information, proprietary information, trade secrets, financial data, etc. In addition, employees may have brought sensitive documentation home that normally stays in the office. The security of this type of business information is critical, yet can be more difficult to ensure when employees are working remotely. And that's simply due to the inherent loss of control that you have. Nonetheless, your organization has likely adopted privacy and security policies as well as systems to make sure those policies are enforced. These may include procedures for securing connections, required authentications, limiting access to data based on job functions, instructions to conduct business only on company-issued equipment, and other subjects as well. But on the front line, as managers, make sure to be vigilant. Make sure you understand these policies and instructions so that you can reinforce them to your team and address any specific concerns right away. Delays can be really problematic. Finally, just a few words about the disability considerations. Like the others, this is a complicated area of law and one that is worthy of its own webinar. For today, I just want to point out that employers who are covered by the disability discrimination laws, such as the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, must address disability accommodation issues in a remote work arrangement just as they do in a regular setting. That means if an employee has a disability-related accommodation in their regular workplace, for example, the need to take additional breaks or perhaps use an ergonomic keyboard or chair, the employer needs to consider providing those same accommodations for an employee's work at home. It also means that an employee may require a new or different accommodation in connection to their shift to working from home. So as a manager, be mindful of any accommodation requests by employees. Don't blow off a request or assume it's not an issue because the employee is working from home or never needed it previously. Rather, engage in a dialogue with the employee, involve HR and/or legal, and follow your normal practices and procedures. Okay, as a wrap up to this webinar, I'd like to leave you with two parting thoughts. Number one, I firmly believe that in many respects, the success of managing remote teams comes down to one key word, and that's communicating. Make sure to do it a lot. Number two, you were chosen to manage employees not simply because you have a strong technical skills or because of your prior accomplishments. It's also because you have the ability to lead people. So even if the current situation is a challenge and one that you couldn't have imagined just 2 or 3 months ago, remember, you can do this. And with that, I will take a look at the questions. Bear with me 1 second. I'm going to try to look in the question box. Okay, I saw some earlier questions about whether you can hear me. Here, one question is about whether it's a good idea to have remote work policies. I think remote work policies take a variety of forms, and they include a variety of topics. Many of them include areas that we've talked about today, like work schedules or work hours or timekeeping or the use of company equipment or how to protect confidential information. I think remote work policies can be very useful, particularly if the procedures and the terms of those policies apply to a broad set of teams rather than having different arrangements for each team within a workforce. But in general, yes, I think that like a handbook collects a set of policies and procedures that apply to employees, so too a remote work policy can address very specific issues in a customized fashion that can be very helpful to managing your remote work employees. Notice though the key, again, with a remote work policy, it's all about communication. It's about letting employees know what the expectations are for the operation and their conduct of business, how you can help and support them, and where they need to go for answers. Again, I think that that's the critical thing here. All right. With that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much for your participation today. I apologize for the technical glitch at the beginning there. I hope this webinar provided you with some useful and practical information and strategies. And on behalf of MSCI, we hope that you'll attend future webinars. As I mentioned at the outset, if there are any other topics that you'd like to see covered in future webinars, please pass along your suggestions to Monique. You have her email. Thank you again, everyone. I hope you stay safe and healthy. Good afternoon.